بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا تأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. اللهم إنا نستهديك لإرشاد أمرنا وزدنا علما ينفعنا وعملا يرفعنا وأحوال وأخلاقا ترضى بها عنا يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم افتح لي بحكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Alhamdulillah, so welcome everybody to our sixth session in this series of Rasa'il Readings, where Alhamdulillah, in today's session we'll be going through the risala fi جواز العمرة في أشهر الحج. Although I've seen the specific title should actually be جواز العمرة للمكي, because I think that makes a difference. So I'm not sure if that's if there's differing options on the manuscript, but this is the actual issue. Alhamdulillah, this text now is by Ibrahim ibn Husayn Pirizâde, who was in 11th century. So you can say, again, I guess this says Ibrahim ibn Hassan. So he's Ibn Husayn. So he's 11th century. You can see 1099 is his date of death. And he was, as the name might suggest, he was an Ottoman scholar. And one of the great later scholars who actually has a lot of writings, mashallah. He has many books. His Rasa'il were published perhaps not so long ago, maybe in the last couple of years. They actually published some of his books, so including his partial sharh on the Ashbah wa Nadha'ir. I believe that's also available now. But his Rasa'il is kind of like a thick volume that they published, so that's quite nice. And he also has he has quite a lot to say, I guess, on Hajj and Umrah related matters, and that's pretty much because he was a very famous senior scholar that was stationed in the Haram, and he was giving a fatwa and teaching and the like there, doing a lot of writing and transmission of the madhab, and he has let's just say he's quite interesting. So he's quite interesting, and there's examples where he is Rasai, where sometimes he is Mullah Ali al-Qari, for example, is passed away at 1014. So he's shortly after Mullah Ali al-Qari, and even with Mullah Ali al-Qari, who's also a Meccan Hanafi kind of scholar stationed there and everything, and there's discussion that he has with him. So it seems like there's a lot of response discussion things which are happening, and it's so from that perspective he's really quite interesting. But of course that isn't necessarily particular to him, because the ulama would always have been doing something like this. But it might just be because he is positioned in kind of like a significant place, and the ulama who were there, then I guess such matters were of great importance to them, because they are around the haram. So they're around the Haram and they are seeing the Hujjaj and they are participating in the Hajj, and there are Masail which are manifesting, and the ulama are coming from the Amsar and they're coming to one place and the like. So issues would likely be raised. And then I guess there's always opportunities to discuss them further. So inshallah, I hope that also his other works continue to get published and continue to reach us. And then he passed away, as I mentioned, in the year 1099, and he is actually prayed upon. They actually do his janazah in the Masjid al-Haram. Right, so this is Pirizâde. He actually has multiple works on the manasik of Hajj as well. So one by Badr ad-Din Shahawi, whom he, I guess, quotes. I wouldn't say extensively, but there are multiple references to Shaykh Mashayikhina, as far as I can recall, of Badr ad-Din Shahawi, even though he's not really hugely significant himself in terms of the literary output that we have from him. Probably one thing which has been published and that I'm aware of Shahawi is his Taraz al-Mudhab in Rasm al-Mufti. But Pirizâde does kind of reference him, I think, in his sharh on the Mansik al-Saghir multiple times. But it seems like he also has a separate sharh on the Mansak of al-Shahawi. So he's so I guess Shahawi obviously had other texts and other writings, but unfortunately they haven't reached us. So this is Pirizâde. So he's still pretty late. So he's about 150 years before, or actually, I mean, if you talk about the beginning, you're talking about 100 years before Ibn Abidin, right? So if you want to place him with the later Damascene kind of tradition, or the significant person, which is Ibn Abidin. So what does he do now in this risala? He wants to explore this mas'ala, which is whether or not it's acceptable for a Meccan, somebody who is in Mecca or its surrounding areas, i.e. within the mawaqit, to perform the umrah during the Ashhur, i.e. the months of the Hajj. So why is this an interesting mas'ala? So interesting mas'ala because there is quite a lot of discussion on it. Right? There's quite a lot of discussion on it. And in fact, some of the ulama have written entire rasa'il on exploring and clarifying this issue. And there's actually, so I'll say it now. I guess I was kind of thinking about whether I should say it at the end. But they actually mentioned that there's three positions on this. So the first position, which was quite a popular position as well, which is that it would be makruh for the individual to perform the umrah during the Ashhur al-Hajj, if he is now going to perform the Hajj. And if so, then he would also be required to pay a dam. Right? So he'd be required to pay a dam. So this was the key idea, really. The key idea was in this time period, from the beginning of Shawwal, right? So from the beginning of Shawwal right up until the Hajj, if you are a Meccan or in the surrounding areas, do you basically now do tawaqquf from performing the Umrah? I just suspend Umrahs now until after the Hajj is over? or are you allowed to continue performing umrahs? And then secondarily, well, you could say a second aspect to this was the idea now of whether or not you're going to be performing the Hajj. So now there's the question of whether it will be problematic if you are performing the Hajj or you're not performing the Hajj. Right? So if you are not performing the Hajj, there are still those of the ulama who said that it would still be makruh. So even though you are not performing Hajj, you're not performing Hajj, in this time, right, the Meccan, it will be makruh for him to perform an umrah. Right? And then others said that if you're performing the Hajj, then this karaha would also mandate the idea of a dam, that you'd be required to pay a dam for this as well. And the third position, which is really the position which he is going to be advocating for in this risala, is that it's not actually makruh for an individual to perform the umrah, even if he intends to perform the Hajj in the same year. Right? So this is now the position that Pirizâde will be advocating in this risala. But you can see how it's a masala that is subject to some quite significant khilaf, and how the famous position was the idea of karaha. Was the second position that it's makruh whether or not he has performed the Hajj? That's correct. Yeah. So the idea is that there's also this position now, which is that it's makruh even if you don't perform the Hajj that year. So basically, these 10 weeks now, effectively that you have between the end of Ramadan and the end of the Hajj or the Yawm al-Nahr or the subsequent days until the Ayyam al-Nahr are over. So this whole period now, right, you simply don't do any umrah at this time, according to that position. Right. So in this second position, is the dam required as well? No. So because this position is about in the absence of, so the idea is that you're either doing the Hajj or not. So if you're doing the Hajj, then they would affirm that you have to give a dam. But if you're not doing the Hajj, is it makruh or not? So the second position is that it's still makruh, even if you're not doing Hajj. But if you're doing the Hajj, then I say it's even more makruh, and you have to give a dam as well. You have to give the penalty as well. And then it was only this third position, which is now what Pirizâde is advocating, which is the idea that it's not makruh to perform the umrah, even if you will be performing the Hajj that year. Right? So it's not makruh, so you can go ahead and perform the umrah. I guess there's one other related masala that maybe I'll just touch upon now before we begin, which is simply the idea of somebody performing multiple umrahs, but they are not a Mecki, right? So they've gone. So for example, somebody's gone for the Hajj, right, from the US, from the UK, from from somewhere else. They've performed the Umrah and they've come out of the Ihram. Are they considered to be like a Mecki? Which means, like, do they just simply avoid, like, do nothing now until the Hajj? Or can they perform the Umrah? So the ulama said, no, this is fine. So although again it was popularized, perhaps because it was tied to this other mas'ala that we're talking about today, i.e. the idea of the Meccan and the khilaf on it. So they're actually it's actually transmitted and recorded that the that they would tell people not to perform umrah. Right? So they would tell people, don't perform umrah because it's makruh, right? Because you're not allowed to do so. So the ulama actually pointed out, Ibn Abidin, for example, even the commentators on the the author of the Irshad Centre on the Mullah Ali al-Qari's sharh of the al-Maslak al-Mutaqassit, which is the sorry, al-Mansak al-Mutawassit. That's what it is. So al-Mansak al-Mutawassit, that is Rahmatullah as-Sindi's middle length text. Like he had like a saghir, and he had a kabir, and he had a mutawassit. So Mullah Ali al-Qari writes a commentary on his mutawassit level text as well, and there are hawashi on the mutawassit level text. So one of them is the Irshad Centre, which is published and available. And so even in there, he comments on this particular issue. So anyway, I don't want us to get confused. Like, we're talking about the Mecki right now. So as for that issue of somebody going from the West, for example, or somebody from outside the Muwaqit, and they're going in that place to perform a tamattu', right, whereby they will be exiting from the ihram, and then can they perform an umrah in the interim between the days of Hajj, between their arrival and their initial umrah and the days of Hajj? The answer to that is yes. So this is okay. The question which we are addressing is the idea of somebody who is in Mecca or the surrounding areas performing the umrah at this time, right? So this is now the backdrop with respect to this risala. So having said that, let us start. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yeah. So I'm using a different edition. So there might be some differences with respect to some of the words. So I guess I've already found issues with both the title of this piece and also how they've spelt the author's name. So anyway, I'll inshallah I'll be turning the pages on here, but I'll probably be reading from my own edition. Yeah, my edition, sorry, is the Dar al-Bashair edition. This is the one I'm using. So it's the Dar al-Bashair al-Islamiyya edition of it. These are from the Liqa al-Ashr al-Awakhir bil Masjid al-Haram, which means that they basically do the reading at Masjid al-Haram, right? So that's where they do it, and they compile these Rasa'il and everything. They actually print them in these thick volumes, and sometimes they publish them separately as well. So they're quite famous. So you can see here that في موسم العشر الأواخر من شهر رمضان المبارك في كل عام. So every year, the last 10 days of Ramadan, they come together in Masjid al-Haram before the Kaaba, and they read through these Rasa'il and the like, and have them published. Right? So that's what they do. So this is the edition which I have. So let's read. So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. فقال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به وبكم آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وبه ثقتي ربي زدني علما وفهما واحفظني من كيد من امتلأ قلبه حسدا وظلما وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد سيد الأصفياء وعلى آله وصحبه الأتقياء. So I personally find Pirizâde really quite his Rasa'il are really on point, right? So they're really fascinating, and he always makes some really good comments as well. But he's really an interesting fellow. So with respect to his discussions, which are sometimes explicit, right, with respect to the scholar whom he is referring to, sometimes, like here, it's not necessarily explicit, like who the other individual is. I guess you could probably dig around and try to find out who it was. So sometimes he's directly addressing this other sheikh, and sometimes not. But he's very, in terms of his approach, there's a very clear method right? So it's quite clear in terms of his methodology and how it's quite distinct, and you'll see it. You'll see it as it's coming out in today's risala. So it'll be quite obvious to you as to what his approach is. So that's so it's quite interesting, really, and his works tend to be like this. Um, yeah. So let's see. So he says فقد كثر السؤال والقيل والقال والقيل والقال فيما شاع وتقرر بين الخاص والعام من كون العمرة في أشهر الحج للمكي ومن بمعناه مكروهة كراهة تحريم ومعصية وأنها لم تشرع في حقه في هذا الزمن. So after praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending blessings on the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, making dua as well, ربي زدني علما وفهما واحفظني من كيد من امتلأ قلبه حسدا وظلما. And then he says there's been a lot of questions and talk with respect to that which is spread between people with respect to the Umrah in the months of the Hajj for the Mecki and those in surrounding areas of it being makruh tahriman and also a sin, and that it's not legislated with respect to him at this time. فطلب مني بعض الفضلاء من المجاورين وجه الصواب في المسألة وما هو المعول عليه عند النقلة. So he says, so one of I guess one of his neighbors, perhaps a teacher, so somebody also in the area, perhaps a fellow, maybe a student, maybe a colleague, somebody. So he says, بعض الفضلاء. He says, have sought the correct answer to this question, and what is the relied upon position. This is معول عليه. He says فتعذرت منه لكثرة أهل الضلال والإضلال. Second, let me get to. I said I was going to turn the page. Yeah. Yeah, فتعذرت. So I guess I guess he is apologizing now and refusing to go ahead with this because he says لكثرة أهل الضلال, because of how many. Imagine he's in the haram, right? He's in the haram. Sometimes people imagine, oh, we live in bad times now. If you should just hear some of the scholars of the past, right? So he said لكثرة أهل الضلال والإضلال. So not only are they misguiding, not only are they misguided themselves, they're also misguiding, right? إضلال. So he says ثم إني استخرت الله تعالى المتعال. One second. So yeah. So he says he prayed the istikhara في جمع ما قاله علماؤنا في المسألة في الأمهات. So with respect to gathering what our ulama have said about this particular question in the central works التي عز وجودها, which are difficult to find. He says وحرم الجهالة فهم معانيها وقيودها, which is again another quite fascinating comment. And you see the ulama saying things like this. I'm trying to remember the other place where I saw something like this recently. Yeah, Imam Bergavi says this. Imam Bergavi says this in his ذخر المتأهلين. So he actually says a similar type of thing. So he says here that the jahala now, who are these jahala? These are ulama, right? These are ulama. So these ignoramuses, he says they've been prevented from understanding the ma'ani of these mutawalat and the like. He says, and also their conditions, because it's not just about the nas, but it's about the ma'ani of the nas, right? So what are you understanding from the nas? He says, وَلَيْسَ ذَلِكَ إِلَّا بِقُوَّةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَالِاسْتِنَادِ إِلَيْهِ لَا مَوْلًا سِوَاهُ. So he says, and none of this will happen except through the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and reliance upon him. But I want you to keep this idea in mind, right? So this is a really important idea. The idea that our scholars have said things in the ummahat, and the jahala of the ulama have simply been prevented from understanding the ma'ani of these nusus. Right? The ma'ani of these nusus are quite clear, but this is rizq. It's not just about having those books, but it's about being able to understand what's in them. So he says, فَنَقُولُ وَبِاللَّهِ التَّوْفِيقِ قال في كتاب الآثار. So he says, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants facilitation. He says, it says in the Kitab al-Athar, قال محمد, or he said محمد قال أخبرنا أبو حنيفة عن حماد عن إبراهيم في رجل من أهل مكة اعتمر في أشهر الحج ثم حج من عامه ذلك قال ليس عليه هدي بمتعته. قال محمد وبه نأخذ وهو قول أبي حنيفة. انتهى. So in the Kitab al-Athar, you can see that there's this riwayah where Ibrahim al-Nakhai, he talks about, so he mentions this exact masala, right? And the person even performs the Hajj in the same year. So he says there's no hadi which is due upon him, and he says hadi is the sacrifice, right? So under normal circumstances for a tamattu', this is wajiba. So he says that this is also his position, also Abu Hanifa's position. فقد أفاد أن العمرة والحج بعدها للمكي جائزة مشروعة بلا كراهة غير أنه لا هدي عليه بخلاف المتمتع والآفاقي. So he says that it's permitted and also legislated in accordance with this. Of course, this is not the whole basis of his argument, but he starts with this nos from the Kitab al-Athar. So he's saying that, as you can see, it's legislated here, but there's no hadi which is due in lieu of it, as opposed to the mutamatti'. So I have wal afaqi, but I guess mutamatti' al-afaqi is better, because of course there's no tamattu' from anybody else anyway. It has to be, yeah, exactly. So it has to be mutamatti' al-afaqi. So he says, وقد صرح بذلك بعض الشراح لكتب الإمام محمد رحمه الله تعالى كصاحب التقويم العلامة الدبوسي رحمه الله تعالى وغيره من الشراح بما نصه. So we'll see that. So he says, so some of the commentators on the books of Imam Muhammad, like Imam Dabusi, and others of the commentators have actually said this explicitly as well. So now he's transitioned away from the hadith to kind of go to the fiqh. And he says, لا متعة ولا قران عندنا لمن كان وراء الميقات على معنى أن الدم لا يجب نسكا. So there's no tamattu' and there's no qiran according to us for somebody who is on this side of the miqat. Right? He says, I guess that's how you'd have to interpret it. He says, على معنى إن الدم لا يجب نسكا. From the perspective that the sacrifice is not due as one of the rites of the Hajj. So أما التمتع فلأنه لا يتصور منه التمتع. So he says the tamattu' is غير متصور, right? Because for somebody on the other side of muwaqit, it is متصور. Right? But somebody on this side of the muwaqit, then it's not possible. للإلمام الذي يوجد بينهما because of the ilmam ولا يكره ذلك انتهى. Right? So because of the ilmam, he says that the tamattu' is not possible. Of course, what is ilmam? This is also an important point. The ilmam is the idea that so what's the tamattu'? Tamattu' is only going to be valid now when certain conditions are fulfilled. And one of those key conditions is simply the idea of uh, a a lack of ilmam, which is reacquainting oneself with one's family, so to speak, which is they don't want you to go back and be with your family and come back, and for this to be a valid tamattu', because the idea of the tamattu' is that you fulfill both pilgrimages in a single journey, right? So in a single journey, but so if you go back to your family, it's a new journey. So if you're from Mecca, you're already with your people, as it were. And that's why it's not legislated for such individuals. He says, فقد أفاد أن دم الشكر غير مشروع. Sorry, next page. في حق المكي ومن بمعناه. The دم الشكر, so because there's different types of dima, the dam being the sacrificial animal. So he says, dam shukr, that's what's required if it's for the mutamattu' or the qarin. And if he's doing qiran or tamattu', then he gives, then he sacrifices out of shukr, and this is wajib. So he says it's not legislated for a Mekki. وإن أحرم بالعمرة في أشهر الحج وحل منها وحج من عامه ذلك لأن من شروطه عدم الإلمام بينهما. So for somebody who performs the Umrah in the Ashhur al-Hajj and exits from the Ihram and then performs the Hajj that year, so it's basically, it looks like tamattu'. So he says, why is it not legislated? Because there's no لأن من شروطه عدم الإلمام, because the condition as there is that they cannot be ilmam, right? This reacquaintance, as we talked about. He says ولذلك قال لا يتصور منه ولا يكره ذلك له. So that's why he said that it's not conceivable, that conceptually it's not possible for him to do tamattu', because tamattu' has a certain form that can't be realized for somebody who is Meccan, right, or in surrounding areas. But he says, but it's not makruh. So this is what he says, Debussy. ويدل على عدم الكراهة في العمرة المفردة أو المعقبة بالحج بعد الإحلال منها. ثبوت النسخ لما كانت عليه الجاهلية من امتناع العمرة للمكي وإنها من أفجر الفجور وقد أجمعت الأئمة عليه كما نصوا عليه في غير ما كتاب. So he says, so what indicates now the absence of karaha with respect to a standalone umrah or an umrah which is followed by a hajj, i.e. after exiting from the state of ihram of the umrah, is the thubut al-nasakh, is the establishment of the abrogation with respect to what the pre-Islamic Arabs had, i.e. the rule which they had, which was min imtina' al-umrati lil-Makki, which is that they prevented the Makki from performing an umrah, and they would say وَإِنَّهَا مِنْ أَفْجَلِ الْفُجُورِ, that it's the worst of sins, right, for somebody to do this. And he's saying that this was abrogated. Right? He says, and the Imma have agreed upon this, as mentioned in different books. So he says قال العلامة الأكمل أي أكمل الدين البابرتي in his عناية, in the Sharh of the Hidayah, النسخ ثابت عندنا في حق المكي أيضا. So he says it's not simply mansukh for somebody who's not a Mekki, but he's saying also for the Mekki. حتى لو اعتمر في أشهر الحج جاز بلا كراهة. Right? So he says that it's permitted explicitly here without karaha. ولكن لا يدرك فضيلة التمتع لأن الإلمام قطع متعته. But he doesn't attain the virtue of the tamattu because the ilmam, this reacquaintance, has nullified his tamattu, right? The hajj tamattu, which he might be, which might otherwise be a virtuous act. So he's saying that this is not possible for him. He says, وفي شرح البخاري للعيني قال ابن الأثير التمتع الترفق. بأداء النسكين على وجه الصحة في سفرة واحدة من غير أن يلم بأهله إلماما صحيحا فلذلك لم يتحقق من المكي انتهى. So he just uses now a reference of from the Umdatul Qari of Ibn al-Athir, which is just so I guess a Shafi'i commentator from the Nihaya, perhaps from his Nihaya fi Gharib al-Hadith. So he talks about the idea of the tamattu, and he says that linguistically it's he says التمتع is what? الترفق بأداء النسكين, i.e. The fulfillment now of both pilgrimages in a valid manner on a single journey without reacquainting oneself with one's family. Sorry, that might not be the best way to express it, but it's just the way that I'm expressing it right now. Because technically it's simply to return back to your family whilst not being in a state of ihram. Right. So this is the technical definition of ilmam. So I'm just calling this like just reacquainting oneself with one's family after the journey to the pilgrimage. He says, so he says because of this, it doesn't apply with respect to the Mecki. He says, وفي المبسوط للسرخسي ولو اعتمر هذا المكي في أشهر الحج ثم حج من عامه ذلك لا يكون متمتعا. Right. So if he performs the umrah in the months of the Hajj and then he performs the Hajj in the same year, he's not considered to be متمتع لأن الآفاقي إنما يكون متمتعا إذا لم يلم بأهله بين النسكين إلماما صحيحا والمكي هنا يلم بأهله بين النسكين حلالا انتهى. So he says, so what's the reason for why he's not considered to be mutamatt'a? He says because the afaqi, he's away from his family at this time, right? So as away from his people and his the place where he lives and so on. So that's why his second pilgrimage is still considered to be acceptable with respect to there being two pilgrimages on the single journey now. But the Mecki, then the same thing. He is kind of with his people, family, and so on, at the whilst being halal, which is the definition. That's why the tamattu is not valid. By family, meaning one's people in their land, not literally one's family, since people would travel for Hajj with their family. Yeah. So it's not literally like his wife or something, but it's the idea that one kind of reacquaints themselves with their watan, with their hometown, with their homeland, right? So that's the idea. So he says وقول الإمام النسفي في تفسيره. So this is so Imam Nasafi, this is Najmuddin Nasafi, right? في تفسيره. So in his تيسير, right? تيسير في التفسير, he says وحاضري المسجد الحرام ينبغي لهم أن يعتمروا في غير أشهر الحج. Yeah, so he says ينبغي لهم, so it's appropriate and for them to perform the umrah in other than the months of Hajj. ويفردون أشهر الحج للحج, and they should single out the months of the Hajj for the Hajj itself. He says, so how do you understand this? He says محمول على أن المستحب في حق حاضري المسجد الحرام. Oh, sorry, I have في حقهم ذلك والكل قائل به. He says this is understood that it's recommended for them to do this, i.e. to single out this period for the Hajj and to do the Umrah at another time. That it doesn't mean that it's wajib for them to do so. So he says, and everybody says, he says, لا أن مراده أن ذلك معصية غير مشروع في حقهم. So he says that it doesn't mean that it's sinful and not legislated for them. كما قد توهمه من لا دراية له ولا رسوخ في المذهب. So again, can you see the commentary that's coming out? He says, so the point is that it's not sinful and it's not not legislated as is imagined by somebody who doesn't have expertise nor firm-footedness in the madhab, right? Because somebody who has expertise in the madhab, somebody who has this mastery of the madhab, they would know that this is not the case. So it's only the waham, the imagination of somebody who doesn't have that familiarity with the madhab and the ulama and the aqwal and the books and the nusus and what's there and their ma'ani and quyud. It's only somebody like that who's going to say otherwise. That's what he's trying to get across. He says, وأقول أيضا هذا الاستحباب لا يظهر وجهه إلا عند ضيق الوقت. So he says, so this recommendation, he says, let me add to this. He's saying this recommendation only, he says it doesn't manifest unless there's only limited time, i.e. short amount of time. He says, وإلا فثواب الإتيان بها في الأشهر الشريفة مع سعة الوقت أفضل وأرجح من تركها وقد أحرم بها الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم مرارا في ذي القعدة. Yeah, so when there's a short period of time, then the idea is that, okay, fine, then leave it for the Hajj. But the idea is that if there's a lot of time there, then he says that in these blessed and noble months, he said this is superior than not doing it. Right? So doing it is superior, and then he brings out the idea that the Prophet ﷺ also did the Umrah multiple times in Dhul Qa'dah, something that he'll come back to later, I think. He says, وَفِي شَرْحِ الِاسْبِجَابِ now. رحمه الله تعالى حاضري المسجد الحرام ليس لهم التمتع والقران وإنما لهم الإفراد بالحج أو العمرة انتهى. Right, so again, quite explicit in that they don't have tamattu or qiran, and they can only do إفراد of حج عمرة. فهذا بصريحه يفيد مشروعية العمرة في حقهم إفرادا لا جمعا بينهما إحراما. Right, so it shows that such individuals can perform the Umrah alone, right? أي حاضري المسجد الحرام can perform the Umrah alone, which is the question that we're discussing, right? He says وفي شرح الكرخي, شرح الكرخي للإمام القدوري. So these are kind of the books that he's talking about, التي عز وجودها and كثير من الجهلة like يعجزون عن فهم معانيها. Right, that they don't have the ability now, so they might have the books, but they don't have the ability to understand what these books are saying. رحمه الله تعالى قد اختلف في العمرة في أشهر الحج. So Imam Quduri saying this, right? So he says وكان عمر, Sayyidina Umar رضي الله عنه ينهى عنها. So Sayyidina Umar would prohibit it. ويقول حجوا في الأشهر واعتمروا في غيرها أكمل لحجكم وعمرتكم. So perform the Hajj in its months and perform the Umrah in other than those months, and this is better for your Hajj and your Umrah. والدليل على جوازها ما روي عن عمران بن حسين رضي الله تعالى عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اعتمر صلى الله عليه وسلم اعتمر مع طائفة من أهله في 10 ذي الحجة. قال عمران ولم ينهى ولم ينزل نسخه. أو لم ينهى. So I guess so he's saying wasn't prohibited, nor was its abrogation revealed. He says وعن عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها قالت ما اعتمر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عمرة إلا شهدتها وما اعتمر إلا في ذي القعدة. So it's not a single Umrah except that I was present therein, and there wasn't a single Umrah except that it occurred in Dhul Qa'dah. وأما عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه فإنه أمر بذلك لمنفعة أهل الحرم. So saying Umar now, so explaining the reason as to why he said this, he said he did it for the people of the أهل الحرم حتى لا يكون موسم في وقت واحد من السنة وهذا لا تعلق له بالوقت انتهى. So this is the end of Imam Quduri's statement now. Right? So he's explained. So what does he say? So the whole khulasa of it is that And there's various proofs indicating that this is legitimate, for somebody to perform the Umrah at this time. And then he's explaining away now Sayyidina uh, Umar's objection, right? That he's saying that he didn't want that this the rest of the time to be empty, right? So he said, okay, let them do Umrah the rest of the time, and at this time, leave it for the Hajj. But again, can you see how? Look at the kinds. Um, sorry, yeah. Did you say حتى لا يكون? I don't have the la. Uh, حتى, yeah. So I have, yeah, actually he says ساقطة من النسخة الخطية. Right. So, but he says وسياق يقتضيها. So sorry, I didn't even think about it because it was just like in a bracket. So just I assumed it was in the manuscript. But we have the Sharh al-Karhi now, so we could actually check it, right? So, but I guess this manuscript, it could be just سبق القلم from the nasikh, because حتى يكون موسم في وقت واحد من السنة doesn't make sense, right? So it needs to be the opposite. Um, yeah. But the point I was going to make is that look at, he started referencing text now, but it's not necessarily what you would imagine, right? Well, at least not necessarily what people imagine. They might start imagining something new now, given publications. But look how he goes to Sharh of Ismi Jabi, right? On the Mukhtasar al-Tahawi. Look how he's going to the Sharh of Imam Quduri on Karkhi's Mukhtasar, right? Like, remember, he's 11th century. Like, you have all the Dur al-Hukam and all the commentaries on it, and you have the Multaqa and all the commentaries, and like you have the Kens and the Bahar, and like everything is there, right? It's not like these haven't manifested yet, right? But you can see he's very deliberate, like where he's going. Anyway, let's keep on going. So he says, وفي شرح الهداية للأكمل. Again, Akmaluddin Babarti was extremely significant, especially for the for the Ottomans. They would teach the Hidayah, as Sajikli Zada says, with Babarti. And that's why they are hawashi on the inaya. So I actually have Imam Birgabi's ta'liqat on the inaya. I think it's only a section of it, but but you only end up with ta'liqat like that if you're teaching it, right? So they would actively kind of study the hidayah with Babarti. So he says قوله, so that's why he's, you can see he's quite referenced here. والعمرة لا تفوت. Also, Babarti is like a Sahib al-Minna as well on the Ottomans, because he's like the Asanid go through Babarti, right? So he's almost like the first sheikh to like teach the Ottomans, and then the Ottomans kind of have their own Asanid after that. So he says قوله والعمرة لا تفوت أي لأنها غير مؤقتة وهي جائزة في جميع السنة يدل ذلك على جوازها في أشهر الحج, right? So he says if it's fine في جميع السنة, then that indicates that it's okay في أشهر الحج as well, right? So he says وقد اختلف السلف في ذلك. So the Sahaba differed about this. وكان عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه ينهى عنها ويقول الحج في الأشهر والعمرة في غيرها أكمل لحجكم وعمرتكم, as we saw before, right? وصحيح جواز. One second. That was the end of the Nas, right? Yeah, I think that was the end of Nas. Sorry, where is it? Yeah, and then والصحيح جوازها بلا كراهة بدليل ما روي أو بدليل ما روى البخاري في صحيحه بإسناده إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه اعتمر في ذي القعدة. He says أربع عمر إلا التي اعتمر مع حجته. I could say, yeah. I guess there's some certain corrections which have happened which are not from the manuscript here. But إلا الذي اعتبر مع حجته. Yeah, so he says, so Sam's position now is that it's permissible without any karaha. And he says there's again the hadith in Bukhari which indicates the same thing that he already mentioned before. Yeah, you're right. It does keep on going. Sorry, because I was just looking at his bracket. But it seems that the way he's saying it as well indicates that it's okay. So he says, وَأَمَّا كَرَاهَتُهَا فِي الْأَيَّامِ الْخَمْسَةِ فَهِيَ مَذْهَبُنَا. انتهى. Yeah, so here's the end. So as for its dislikedness now in the 5 days, i.e. Yom Arafah and the Yom Nahar and the Yom Tashriq, these are the 5 days where it's considered to be makruh. So he says, so this is our madhab now. He says, وفي الفوائد الظاهرية وقد صح أن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه نهى الناس عن المتعة فقال متعتان كانتا على عهد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وأنا أنهى عنهما متعة النساء ومتعة الحج. So he says there are 2 types of mut'a which were present in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and he says, and I am prohibiting them. He says the first is mut'atun nisa, so mut'a, I just as the temporary marriage type of thing, and he says, well, I guess not really marriage, it's mut'a, but marriage is something else. That would be nikah mu'aqqad. He says wa mut'atul hajj, and the mut'a of hajj, i.e. the hajj tamattu'. He says قلنا قلنا تأويله. So this is now the explanation of this. أنه كره أن يخلو البيت عن الزوار في غير أشهر الحج. Right, so he disliked the absence of visitors in other than the months of the Hajj. فأمرهم بأن يعتمروا بسفر مقصود في غير أشهر الحج. So he commanded thus that they perform the umrah with a dedicated journey, just for the umrah, in other than these months. لئلا يخلو البيت عن الزوار في شيء من الأوقات لا أن يكون التمتع مكروها عنده بدليل حديث صبي ابن معبد انتهى. Yeah, so he says it's not that he considered it to be makruh, but he had a very it was a very purposeful decision. So he says, except for the hadith, I wonder if he puts a hadith here. He just says لم أعثر عليه. Yeah, so I guess we can look up what that is. He says فهذا صريح في كون النهي إنما هو لأمر آخر. So he says, so this is explicit now in that the prohibition was for a different matter. لا لكون العمرة معصية غير مشروعة في أشهر الحج للمكي وغيره فتأمله واحذر من التعصب. Yeah, so he says that it was for another reason, not because it was sinful and not legislated in these months for the Mecki or other than Mecki. So he says, so contemplate this, so think about it, and be wary of being narrow-minded or the like. A unsound deed, like without dalil, taking a side, because this is the definition of the ta'assub. عدم قبول الحق عند ظهوره لوجود ميل إلى جانب. Right, so this is how they define ta'assub. So not accepting the truth, so when it manifests because of because of taking a side, as because you're taking a side on it. He says ثم قال الشارح المذكور. So then the شارح المذكور أي البابرتي he continues. He says أولا عند الاستدلال على الإمام الشافعي رحمه الله تعالى في نفي مشروعية المتعة والقران المكي عندنا بنص المكي عندنا من أهل التمتع والقران، ولكن الشرط الذي كان به غيره أهلا لا يتصور منه. So when he's talking when he's doing the istidlal against Imam Shafi'i with respect to its not being legislated, i.e. the tamattu and the Quran, he says المكي عندنا من أهل التمتع والقران. He says so he says عندنا من أهل التمتع والقران. So we say the opposite. Right? We say there's no tamattu, there's no Quran for the Meccan. Right? So he's saying the Shafi'i said this. He said ولكن الشرط الذي كان به أي بشرط غيره أي غير المكي أهلا لا يتصور منه. Right? So the shart, which is the idea that we talked about earlier, it's not conceptually possible. Right? It's not possible. So he said أما النسخ لما كانت عليه الجاهلية من كون العمرة معصية في أشهر الحج للمكي فثابت أيضا فثابت عندنا. So as for the نسخ, he says that this is established according to us. والمكي يعتمر في أشهر الحج ولا يكره له ذلك. So he performs Umrah in the Ashhur al-Hajj, and it's not makruh. ولكن لا يدرك فضيلة التمتع, but he doesn't attain unto the virtue of the tamattu. لأن الإمام بأهله قطع متعته, because the fact of the reacquaintance, quote unquote, with his hometown just being present at home means that you're unable to do tamattu, right? Because you didn't journey without seeing your family in a state of non-ihram in between. He says كما يقطع متعة الآفاق إذا رجع إلى أهله, just as the afaqi, if he comes, right, he comes to the haram, he performs umrah, he goes back home, and then he comes back for the hajj. So this is hajj al-ifrad. This is not tamattu. That's the idea. So even though he did an umrah in the ashhur al-hajj. So he says والقران يصح من المكي إذا أقبل من خارج انتهى. That's a separate masala now. That Qiran is conceivable if the Makki leaves, like for some reason for Hajj or something, he goes somewhere else, then he comes back, then he intends a Qiran. So that's an exceptional kind of, that's outside the discussion right now. He says أقول لا نزاع في صراحة هذا على مشروعية العمرة للمكي. So he says, you can see Babarti is very, very explicit with respect to affirming the legislation of the Umrah for the Makki. وَمَنْ بِمَعْنَاهُ مِنْ غَيْرِ كَرَاهَةٍ, without karaha. He said it very explicitly. حَجَّ مِنْ عَامِهِ أَوْ لَمْ يَحُجْ. So whether he does the Hajj or he doesn't. وبه اندفع ما ذكره العلامة المحقق ابن الهمام عند ذكر الخلاف الواقع للمكيين مع الآفاقيين. So he says, and based upon that, what the Muhaqqiq Ibn al-Humam said, where he distinguished between the Makki and the Afaqi, he says, وَاخْتَارَهُ الْمَنْعَ مُطْلَقًا. His conclusion of it being prohibited for them, he said that this is warded off by what Babarti has just explained now. He says وهو معذور لعدم وقوفه على كلام من تقدم والحق لا يجوز العدول عنه لأحد مطلقا. So again, why is Ibn al-Humam now معذور? He's معذور because he didn't find a naqad, right? He didn't find any of the ulama saying this. So again, what's he showing you? He's showing you that I've researched, even like I've gone beyond like even Ibn al-Humam. Like, so the idea is that I'm saying that even he is now ma'adhur because he didn't find the nusus that I'm showing you now, right? So he's ma'adhur with respect to his conclusion. Ibn al-Humam is quite fascinating actually on this issue because it's actually recorded that he that although his initial position appeared to indicate that it is acceptable, he actually, after 30 years, he changed his mind. So he said 30 years later, that's what they actually mention, that 30 years later, he actually changed his mind and said that actually this is not permissible. So, but again, I find that like a fabulous teaching point that look at these ulama, there's no such thing as I just do tahqiq and this is my answer and that's the end and nobody can object to me and wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, don't talk to me about it, I've done tahqiq. Because the idea is that he did the tahqiq and everything, but the idea is that for decades after that, it's still, the masail are still on his mind. And he still has the humility at that point to turn around and say, well, I simply don't believe this anymore. I don't believe this anymore. And this is the nature of ilm. The futuhat continue to manifest, right? If somebody dedicates themselves to it, and they put their, this is where they dedicate their life. The idea is that the answer that you get at one point isn't necessarily the answer which will manifest to you at a later point in life, right? And that's why you have to have sa'at al-ittila', right? You have to like read a lot, you have to research a lot, you have to think a lot, you have to ask a lot of questions. And when you do all of that and you come to a reasonable conclusion, again, it's not qat'i, right? It might be again that something manifests at a later point whereby you realize that maybe this is unsound, right? And then you might end up saying what Pirizâde said over here, right? That he said, well, he's ma'dhur because he didn't find a naql. Because the idea is that you're not making up masail. Of course, that doesn't mean that we need like every single book in the tradition to be published and available before we can do any fiqh. But the idea is that it just shows you that there's a i'tibar to the kalam of the kibar, right? And the fact that we don't have a lot of their books, and only in recent times that, alhamdulillah, there's been a bit of a renaissance, as it were, with respect to earlier Hanafi books being published. Then this gives us a lot of opportunity to actually to go back. So even if we had read this last year, maybe before that, we wouldn't even had. So even now, there's because I got it right, I have it right here. But like the Asrar of Imam Dabusi that he keeps quoting now, right? So the Asrar is now published, right? So the fact that we have access to these books which weren't previously accessible, right, is a huge blessing. But the idea is that, again, there now has to be we actually have to sit down with the kibar, because remember, sometimes even we're talking about like Ibn Humam over here, but even Ibn Abidin, he did not have even some of the books that we have now. So even imagine, like, that's Ibn Abidin, like he didn't have some of the books that we have now. So at the end of the day, the even books and that type of things, these are all arzaq, like there's all a rizq. But it's not about the presence, it's not about you having the book and he didn't have it, but that it's the rizq of fahm, right? And the fiqh and the fahm and the ma'ani. And this is what if somebody has that, then they don't necessarily need the book to arrive at the answer, because the ma'ani might lead them to that answer anyway. Okay, so he says, وَمَنْشَأُ اختلافهم, he says, تركهم للقيد الذي وقع في البدائع. So what's the reason for their disagreement now? He says the reason why they're disagreeing is because they left an important conditioning which was mentioned by صاحب البدائع. He says أولا وآخرا مع صراحته في كون العمرة في حقهم لا تكون معصية إلا إذا جمع بينهما إحراما في الأشهر. They mentioned explicitly صاحب البدائع that it's only considered to be a sin if he joins between both the umrah and the hajj with a single so with one ihram, and then he joins the other ibadah to it, so within the months. So this is a problem. فإن العمرة في حقهم حينئذ غير مشروعة ومعصية. So he says, so that's the case where it's considered to be not legislated and also sinful. Does he have any shuruh on the books of Imam Muhammad, as he seemed to imply before? Yeah, I believe so. I think you can find books of commentaries on Zahir Riwayah and the like. I mean, everybody was pretty much doing that in that time period. So whether it's Alwani or Sarakhsi, or these are all like Quduri. Not Quduri. But yeah, I guess you could say Halwani and Quduri and Dabusi. All of these guys are living in the same era, right? But their shughul perhaps is slightly different. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that you can find Zahir Riwayah, maybe a Jama Kabir or Jama Saghir or something, by Dabusi at the very least. He says, وَلِذَلِكَ قال في المبسوط للسرخسي وليس للمكي أن يجمع بينهما. So the Makki can't join between Umrah and Hajj. فإذا صار جامعا من وجه كان عليه الدم. So if he does join, then a dam would be due. ولو كان هذا آفاقيا لم يكن عليه الدم. So if he's آفاقي outside the مواقيت, then no dam is due لأنه غير ممنوع من الجمع بينهما وعليه دم لأنه صار كالمتمتع وهو منهي عن التمتع. So everybody agrees that if you do إضافة الإحرام إلى الإحرام, this is makruh and you have to give a dam. Right? So this is what he's expressing now. So the idea is that the problem is in the إضافة الإحرام إلى الإحرام, that joining one إحرام to another إحرام. So he says ونص البدائع قد صح عن عمر رضي الله عنه أنه قال ليس لأهل مكة تمتع ولا قران وعن ابن عمر وابن عباس وابن الزبير مثله. Sorry, it's next. He says, yeah. So he says لأن ميقات أهل مكة للحج الحرم والعمرة الحل فلا يتصور الجمع بينهما. Yeah, so you can't do جمع between them. ولأن التمتع والقران إنما شرع لأهل الآفاق ترفيها وتيسيرا عليهم بإسقاط أحد السفرين. So why is it legislated for أهل الآفاق? For facilitative reasons. That you don't have to journey twice to do the Hajj and the Umrah. You can do both. You can do both together. فلا يوجد هذا المعنى في حق المكي وما بمعناه. But for Mecca or surrounding areas, then this معنى doesn't exist because you don't have to travel. It's right there. لأنه لا سفر في حق المكي فلا حاجة إلى الترفيه فلم تكن العمرة مشروعة في حقهم فبقيت العمرة في أشهر الحج في حقهم معصية. انتهى كلامه. So this is what the Bada'iyah says. So he comments now. Pirizâde comments here. الصريح في كون العمرة he said الصريح في كون العمرة معصية في كون العمرة معصية في حقهم خاص بصورة الجمع لا أنه المنهي عنه مطلقا فافهمه. Right? So this is the key idea here, where he says that when he mentioned معصية over here, the idea is that he's talking about جمع. He's not talking about it when it's done إفرادا. So interestingly, he has the muhaqqiq of the edition I'm using, he just has a short comment here that I'll just read. Actually, it's a bit lengthier, but I won't read the whole thing. But he says قال العلامة المحقق الشيخ قاسم ابن قطلوبغة في شرحه على مناسك الهداية. Right? So he did a شرح on the manasik of the hidayah. He says وما ذكره شيخنا الكمال ابن همام أن العمرة المكي ممنوعة سواء حج من عامه أو لا. قلت وهذا ليس من مذهب علمائنا رحمهم الله تعالى. Right? Remember Ibn Qutlubughah, his sheikh is Ibn Humam. But look, this is not the ilm. They were not trained to be puppets, right? They are trained in ilm. Even if the sheikh does mukhalafat al-madhab, even though he's my teacher, is mukhalafat al-madhab, what do I say in my book? You know what my teacher said? Yeah, this is khata. Right? So this is literally what he says. وهذا ليس من مذهب علمائنا. It is not the madhab of our ulama. Right? I.e. that this is khas bihi. Ibn Humam, this is his position. But it's not the madhab of the ulama. And then he quotes some more. He says وفي إيضاح طرق السالك الناسك إلى العلم والعمل بالمناسك. للعلامة خير الدين ابن عمران الحنفي. Yes, one line. He has like I'm not sure if he mentions it over here. Omar. Yeah, you can see here. أبو الخير ابن الشمس الغزي ثم المقدسي الحنفي. So he's a Gazan. Subhanallah. فرج الله عن سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعن إخواننا في فلسطين وفي غزة خاصة. آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. So what does he say? He said ويستحب أن يعتمر في كل شهر وإن فعله مرتين أو ثلاثا فليفعل. So it's recommended to perform the Umrah every month. If you can do it twice or three times, let him do that. ويشتغل في بقية الشهور بالطواف والصلاة. وسواء في ذلك أشهر الحج وغيرها والمكي وغيره يدل عليه عبارة أصحاب المختصرات. Right? So here, what does he say? He says, so in his compendium, like his work now on the ahkam of the Hajj and the umrah, or just manasik, generally speaking. So he literally says it quite explicitly, right? That this applies whether it's Ashhur al-Hajj or other than the Ashhur al-Hajj, and whether he's a Mecki or other than a Mecki. The idea is that he says this is يدل عليه عبارة أصحاب المختصرات, أي the مختصر, the authors of the مختصر works. وما في النهاية من قوله, and in the Nihaya, again another published Sharh of the Hidayah. Remember the Shurah of the Hidayah have a tremendous maqam. Right, so and alhamdulillah, it's another great blessing that we have many of the commentaries, many of the great commentaries of the Hidayah are now getting published. Right, so of course we had the Ghayatul Bayan, which is probably one of the tremendous, one of the, if not the greatest, commentary on the Hidayah, which is published. But the Nihaya is one of the earliest of the commentaries, because Husayn ad-Din Sighnaqi, he is 714, I believe, 714, and he's basically two people off Sahib al-Hidayah, or even one person off Sahib al-Hidayah. I think they would say that he is. Oh, I think if yeah, at worst case scenario is like two people off, right? So, but basically in that he's a very important early commentator on the Hidayah, and so what does he say? وأما النسخ فثابت عندنا في حق المكي أيضا. Of it being a sin. Remember we talked about this with the Jahiliyyah. يعتمر في أشهر الحج ولا يكره ذلك لكن لا يدرك فضيلة التمتع لأن الإمام قطع متعته كما في متعة الآفاق إذا رجع بين النسكين إلى أهله. Right? Everything that we discussed before. ثم ذكر ما نقلناه أولا عن تفسير النسفي رحمه الله تعالى, أي التيسير في التفسير, not the مدارك والتنزيل, although it might be in the مدارك. We can check that. He says أقول هذه الدلالة, again a really important, another really important نقل now. So listen to what he says here now. أقول هذه الدلالة من أقوى ما يعتمد عليه. Right, so the strongest of that which is to be relied upon now. لأن المرجع في الإفتاء والعمل على المتون ومفهومها. Right, so what's the marja في الإفتاء? Right, in terms of the fatwa, in terms of the answer to the question, على المتون and the mafhum of those mutun. Right, so you go back to the mutun because the mutun again have a makana in the madhab. The Kanz is a tremendous work, and the mafhum of the Kanz is mu'tabar. The mafhum of Quduri is mu'tabar. Right, so all of these books are incredibly important, and the Hidayah, again, of the greatest of the, because the Hidayah mu'tabara, what do they say? What's ibara? Here they have this ibara, would say mu'tabara min al-mutun, or something to that effect. So they consider the Hidayah to be a matan. Right, so that's why they treat it like a matan, even though technically it's a sharh, and the commentators are super commentators. Right, so in the sense that it's a second, but they just treat the Hidayah like a matan, and the commentators are simply the shurah of the Hidayah. So he says لأن المعتبر اعتبار مفهوم الرواية. So the mafhum of that which is transmitted now. وبهذا كله يعلم أن ما ذكره الإسبيجابي. And based on all of this, it is now known that what Isbijabi mentioned, رحمه الله تعالى, في شرحه الكبير والصغير على الطحاوي, because he had two commentaries on the مختصر الطحاوي. Again, مختصر الطحاوي, an extremely important book in the madhab. Right, so thankfully we have at least two commentaries now published on it, but hopefully we'll get more. He says وما في تحفة الفقهاء من أهل مكة من أن أهل مكة إذا تمتعوا أو قرنوا فقد أساءوا ولازمهم دم الإساءة لإساءتهم، يعني إذا جمعوا بين إحرام العمرة والحج، وهو أصل صورة التمتع المشروع في حق الآفاقي دون المكي، لأن إضافة الإحرام إلى الإحرام في حق المكي جناية كما في النهاية وغيرها من كتب المذهب. So now he's going to express this ma'na, which is that the Isa'ah manifests through the idafa, not through the umrah which is done مفردا, i.e. that it's done alone. So this is what he expresses now. So he says قال في شرح الجامع الصغير. This is Qadi Khan. Right, so that's also published. He says مكي ومن بمعناه ممن ليس له التمتع والقران أهل بعمرة ثم أهل بحج أو على العكس فإنه يكون مسيئا, because it's جمع. He entered into the state of ihram for umrah and then the hajj, or the hajj and then the umrah. He says ثم ينظر إن أحرم بعمرة أولا ثم بالحج إن لم يطف لعمرته فإنه يرفض العمرة ويمضي على حجته وعليه دم لرفض عمرته وقضاؤها فإن مضى فيهما لزمه دم لجمعه بينهما. So then there's a discussion with respect to, do you have to do رفض العمرة? So there's discussion about that, and then you have to do a dam, you have to do a qada because you did rafd of the umrah, which is that to remove the umrah from your ihram. And then if you don't do any of that and you go through with it, then you have to do a dam because it's a jinayah. So anyway, it's taking us outside a little bit. But that's like the مسائل of إضافة الإحرام إلى الإحرام. وفي شرح قاضي خان للجامع. Okay, I mean شرح الجامع الصغير. We'd have to see. Maybe we'd have to see who the author is of that. I mean, we have a bunch of commentaries now, but here he's explicit that it's Qadi Khan. So he says وإن مضى عليها أجزأه لأنه أداها كما التزم. إلا أنه منهي. So if he does it, then it's valid, but it was prohibited. والنهي لا يمنع تحقق المنهي عنه. Just because it's prohibited doesn't, because there's an usuli mas'ala now. If something's prohibited, that it entails the ability to actually do that particular action, right? Otherwise, it would be taklif ma la yutaq, and it leads to other issues. So he says وعليه دم لجمعه بينهما لأنه تمكن النقصان في العمل بارتكاب المنهي عنه ونقائص النسك تجبر بالدم. So he brought about some degree of nuqsan now in the amal by doing something prohibited, and those deficiencies in pilgrimages are made up through the dam. وهذا دم جبر لا يباح له التناول كسائر دم الكفارات. So you can't consume from it because there's a khilaf on some of them. Not khilaf, sorry, but the idea is that some of the dima you can actually eat from them, i.e. when it's dam shukr, but when it's dam jinaya, then of course you can't eat from it. So he says like the other expiatory dima. وفي البحر العميق لأنه في وقت غير مشروع فصار جانيا بالجمع. So again explicitly saying جمع. وفي الطرابلسي in his مناسك وعليه دم للجمع بينهما أداء في إحرامين, again جمع. وهذا دم جبر للنقصان بارتكاب ما هو منهي عنه. انتهى. وفي شرح الأكمل so بابرتي again وإن مضى عليهما وأداهما أجزاؤه لأنه أدى أفعالهما كما التزمهما غير أنه منهي عنهما أي عن إحرام الحج وإحرام العمرة جميعا. You can't do both. وفي شرح الكرخي لأنه جمع بين الإحرامين. Again, you can see جمع. Right? So this is the ma'na that he's trying to get across. That look, every time they talked about it being prohibited for the Mecki, it was always in the context of jama'. So this is what he's trying to say. So he says لأنه جمع بين الإحرامين على وجه منهي فأدخل النقص في أحدهما وهذا دم جبر وليس بدم تمتع, because the tamattu is not valid, so it can't be dam tamattu, which is dam shukr. So it's dam jabr because you done something wrong and you can't eat from dam jabr. ولا يقوم صوم مقامه, and you can't do the other alternatives which are sometimes there present. ولا يجوز الأكل منه. وفي انتهى. وفي شرح الجامع الصغير للتمرتاشي. So Tumurtashi is now his commentary on the جامع الصغير وإن طاف لعمرته أربعا أو زيادة مضى عليهما وعليه دم لجمعه بينهما لأنه صار كالمتمتع ولا تمتع له. انتهى. So he did 4 or more rounds, so effectively he's done like an umrah, like like that's like the fard of the umrah, because everything else is wajib. وفي منتخب المحيط للعلامة العيني رحمه الله تعالى لو أحرم المكي بعمرة ثم أحرم بحجة قبل أن يطوف للعمرة رفض العمرة. So again, the idea of rafd that we talked about before. فإن مضى فيهما, but if he does them لزم دم للجمع بينهما, because he did جمع he has to give a dam لأنه لا يجوز له الجمع, because you're not allowed to do that. فإذا جمع فقد احتمل وزرا, then he's taken on sin. ولازمه الكفارة, and he has to expiate for that. ثم لا بد من رفض أحدهما نزوعا من المعصية. انتهى. He has to do rafd of one of them as we saw earlier. وفي البدائع ولو جمع المكي بين الحج والعمرة في أشهر الحج فعليه دم، لكن دم كفارة الذنب لا دم شكر النعمة عندنا انتهى. Again, in the بدائع, if the Makki joins between Hajj and Umrah, then a dam is due, and this is دم جبر. فهذا كما ترى صريح في كون الدم والإساءة للجمع بينهما إحراما. Right? So he says all of this now, as you can see, the إساءة manifests because of the جمع. He says حتى لو أحرم بالعمرة في أشهر الحج ثم حل منها وأحرم بالحج وحج من عامه لا كراهة فيه ذلك ولا معصية لفقد الموجب لهما والله الهادي. Right? So this is the khulasa of everything now, that if you perform the umrah now في أشهر الحج, exit from the ihram and then enter into a new ihram even the same year to perform the hajj, then this is not prohibited, it's not makruh, and there's no ma'siyah in it. So it says فالحاصل أن العمرة في أشهر الحج للمكي ومن بمعناه مشروعة وإن حج من عامه ولا كراهة في ذلك مطلقا ما لم يجمع بينهما إحراما كما رأيته منقولا عن الكتب التي عليها المؤول. So you can see that the Umrah now, في أشهر الحج, for the Meccan and those in surrounding areas, is legislated even if he performs the Hajj in the same year and there's no karaha in it whatsoever, as long as he doesn't join between them to do them in a single ihram, as you've seen explicitly mentioned, منقولا من الكتب التي عليها المعول. So look, what were the books that he went to? Like شروح on Jami' al-Saghir, and then books like the Sharh of Mukhtasar al-Karhi, Akmaluddin al-Babarti, his Sharh on the Hidayah, and then some books like the Bahr al-Amiq, which is like the key work in one of the most expansive works on the Masail of Hajj. Right? So these are the kind of texts that he went to come to this conclusion. So he says, وما وقع في المناسك مناسك ملا رحمة الله السندي أو مناسك ملا رحمة الله السندي رحمه الله تعالى ومن بعده فهو تقليد لبعض أهل المناسك المتأخرين فيما فهموه وقالوه لعدم وقوفهم على النقل وقد رأيت ما هو الحجة والمستند في ذلك. Right, so now he's picking up on the fact that some of these mutaakhirin, like Mullah Rahmatullah As-Sindi, simply transmitted this idea of the impermissibility of the person doing this, right? So the Makki to do this and so on. So he's saying this is taqleed li ba'di ahli manasik al-mutaakhirin. So look how he's saying the mutaakhirin, right? The mutaakhirin, this is whom he is following. Are you supposed to follow some of the mutaakhirin? No, the idea is the muawwal is ala ma qalu, like ma qala al-mutaqaddimun, right? So the mutaqaddimun, what they say, if the mutaakhirin is saying something different, then we have to see what is the, like, how did you arrive at this conclusion? Right? He says, فيما فهموه وقالوه لعدم وقوفهم على النقل. So it's based on what they are understanding, right? Based on the fahm of the ma'ani, because they haven't seen any naql about it. Again, this is why books are important. This is why ulama are important. This is why the darajat of the ulama, the tabaqat of the ulama, this is so important to know and to realize that somebody who is like from the mutaakhirin and mutaqaddimin is not the same. You can't compare like Imam Shulun Bulali ala jalalati qadrihi, right? That with Imam Sarakhsi or Qadi Khan. This is not the same. This is not a fair comparison. You cannot compare the ulama like this. Why did they write the mullah with a noon? Then we don't figure that out. Min la rahmatullah sindi. I'm not sure, to be honest, but I know Ibn Abdin, he has a note about it. So if you check the hashia on min la, you'll actually find him saying that this is like a lugha or something, like some people say it. Maybe it's not subcontinental people. Maybe it's like other people, they say minla. But yeah, but it's around. Okay, so he says وقول صاحب البحر الرائق. Look how he's come to the متأخرين now, right? So بحر الرائق now he's got to. So because remember Mullah Rahmatullah As-Sindi, he's 993. So he's 100 years prior to Pirizâde, right? And then Bahr al-Ra'iq is 9. What is Bahr al-Ra'iq? 9 to, I can't remember. But anyway, 970, yeah, Jazakallah khairan. Yeah, that's right. So it's 970. So again, similar. It's just before Rahmatullah al-Sindi, right? So what does he say? والحاصل أن المكي إذا أحرم بالعمرة في أشهر الحج فإذا كان من نيته الحج من عامه إلى آخره وقوله oh sorry I get distracted. I was reading from my own copy. Let's get back to where we were. Here we are. So he says إلى آخره وقوله ثانيا وإن لم يكن من نيته الحج من عامه لا يكون آثما بالاعتمار في أشهر الحج. So he talks about the idea of whether you have an intention or you don't have the intention. So he says أقول جعله مناط الإثم جعله مناط الإثم النية وعدمها من تصرفاته التي لم تبنى على نقل. So he says his making this masala, right, revolve around the idea of the niyyah, and the lack of it is from is basically him doing something which is not based upon naql, and it's also mutanaqid. It's also contradictory. He says لأنه نقل عن غاية البيان, because he transmitted from غاية البيان, right, which is Atqani that we were talking about earlier, one of the great commentators on the Hidayah that alhamdulillah thankfully we have access to now. It says أن مقتضى قولنا لم يصح تمتع المكي للإمام الصحيح, i.e. that the tamattu of the Makki is invalid because of the Imam, because of his being present in أنه لو أحرم بعمرة في أشهر الحج وحل منها ثم أحرم بالحج فإنه لا يلزمه دم. Right? So he says contradictory for him to say this after quoting Atqani, where he says quite explicitly that no dam is due, وأقره عليه, and he also affirmed that this was sound and correct. So وهذا مناف لكلامه. Right? So this negates what he was saying over there, because he makes it sinful and so on. And we'd have to see the whole nas, but that's the khulasa. And then he has a short tatimma. What does he say? He said تتمة العمرة في اللغة الزيارة. يقال اعتمر يعتمر فهو معتمر أي زار وقصد. So it indicates a زيارة, a visit. So that's the لغوي المعنى of it. وقيل إنها مشتقة من عمارة المسجد الحرام. It's also a different اشتقاق of it as well. No worries. بارك الله فيكم. He says وفي الشرع الطواف والإحرام والسعي والحلق واجب. Right, so according to the Shara now, what's the definition of it? He says the tawaf, so it's to perform a tawaf, to enter into state of ihram, of course not in that order, say ihram first and tawaf, but he's just kind of saying the different matters. He says wasa'i, and then sa'i after the tawaf, and then the halq, and then the shaving of the head. He says wajib. He says waqawluhum, so of course you could say the ihram is like kind of like a shart rukn type thing. They have a discussion about it. And the tawaf is the fard, and then the other three are wajibat. He says وقولهم العمرة من أفجر الفجور, is the worst of sins, أي أعظم الذنوب وهذا من تحكماتهم الباطلة المأخوذة من غير أصل. Yeah, it's just an arbitrary kind of thing that they're saying, which has no asl for it. He says والفجور الانبعاث في المعاصي وقد فجر يفجر من باب نصر ينصر كما قاله العلامة العيني. Yeah, so Al-Aini said fujur is انبعاث في المعاصي, which is kind of just like the coming forth or the gushing forth of ma'ani. معاصي sins. He says وقال الأكمل من أسوأ السيئات, so again worst of sins. وقال ابن حبان في صحيحه إن عمرة الجعرانة كانت في شوال. So it was عمرة الجعرانة was in Shawwal. Shawwal is the first of أشهر الحج, right. قال محب الطبري ولم ينقل ذلك أحد غيره فيما علمت والمشهور أنها في ذي القعدة. So he says, so this is there in Ibn Hibban, but Al-Muhib al-Tabari said nobody else transmitted this. They actually said it was in the Qa'dah, as we've seen earlier in the Risala. وقال الطبري إن الثلاث كانت في ذي القعدة. He also mentioned that earlier in the Risala as well, that all three were actually in the Qa'dah. Sayyidah Aisha, hadith of Sayyidah Aisha, he said, she said, رضي الله تعالى عنها, that that's when they were. وأما العمرة الرابعة فهي التي مع حجته. So this was one with the Hajj. Right, so the Umrah with the Hajj. So he says عليه الصلاة والسلام وكانت أفعالها في ذي الحجة ذي الحجة بلا خلاف. So everybody agrees that the Umrah was done in ذي الحجة. He says كما قاله العلامة العيني في شرحه للبخاري. So he says أقول والذي في موطأ الإمام محمد بن حسن أنها ثلاث حيث قال حدثنا مالك قال أخبرنا هشام بن عروة عن أبيه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يعتمر إلا ثلاث عمر إحداهن في شوال والثنتين في ذي القعدة انتهى. So he's saying that this is actually مخالف now what Badr al-Din al-Aini is mentioning. It's actually مخالف to what the riwayah in the Muwatta indicates, which is that there were three. Yeah, so one in Shawwal and then two in the Qa'dah. He says قال مؤلفه وهذا آخر ما تيسر جمعه وتقريره من النقول والله الهادي للصواب تحريرا you guys don't have anything else? Yeah, so what do I have here? Oh, that's just the katib. Sorry, that's it. He does تحريرا في قرة شوال عام 83 وألف من الهجرة النبوية وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما على يد كاتبه الفقير إلى الله تعالى أحمد بن علي العودي عفى الله عنه عنهم آمين. So الحمد لله الحمد لله الذي بنعمته تتم الصالحات. So this is the risala, and you could see how it's a very interesting masala, but also how there's so much discussion. But the key idea was, because we talked right at the beginning that there's still, despite what Pirizâde's conclusion is, and others, of course, agree with him as he expressed, and even after that, there's still discussion which is happening. There are these positions. Right? So there are positions about it, but the key thing was just the idea of the manhaj. So that was very he talks about the authoritative books, what you should actually rely upon. Sorry, are you sorry, is everyone following? I apologize. Yeah, everyone can hear, right? Okay, good. Anyway, I was just talking about the idea that he makes a lot of comments about the mutaqaddimin versus mutaakhirin, and relied upon books versus books that might not necessarily be relied upon, without necessarily talking about them. Authoritative books, the idea of not everybody understands the ma'ani of those texts, and also their quyud and the like. So all of these types of things are very, very important to kind of take in. Also, his idea about how some people don't necessarily understand the madhab, right? So they don't understand the madhab even though they're trained in the madhab, right? So this is also quite important to take in. So all of this is you can see there's a salaf, right? So the ulama, this is how they were, and this is how they will respond to issues, and there's a clear method which is being followed, and at the end of the day, it's this is very convincing, right? It's very convincing if you see like all of his arguments and everything. And we'd have to see what other, what the others of the ulama said. It'd be nice sometime to see like a counter risala, or where somebody has said something contrary to this, to kind of see if it's legitimate. But like we said, maybe he's just following, for example, the conclusions of Ibn al-Humam. And remember, Ibn al-Humam, he changed his position after 30 years. Right. So we're not denying that those positions are there. That Sahib al-Bada'iyah also intimates something, even though the nusus which he brought over here from the Bada'iyah appear to say something else. So again, that would require like a full kind of discussion and reading of that section of the Bada'iyah to kind of see exactly what's going on. But at least his filtration of that discussion culminates in him saying that the Bada'iyah is actually talking about Jama'. He's not talking about, even though others have kind of noted that the Bada'iyah would actually seem to be one of the authority figures who holds the position that it's makruh even if there's no Hajj, right? So even if there's no Hajj that year. It seems that in some later shuruh which are taught, they do mention the karaha mutlaqan and don't say much else. They seem to be an important thing to be aware of. Here's her read Rasa'il on every. Yeah, I mean, that's why it's quite interesting that he said, what you find in the monastic works like the of the mutaakhirin, like Mullah Rahmatullah as-Sindi and others, which again became very, very popular. So, and like I mentioned at the beginning, even Pirizâde has like a sharh on the Mansak al-Saghir. So if these books become popular, then they become mushar ilayha, that you point to these books, right? In terms of, well, it says here that, I mean, the idea is that that's not a hujjah, like in and of itself, especially when others are saying something else. But you're absolutely right. It just shows you the kind of depth that we really have to get to understand the masail. And the fact that the ulama are writing these types of things to clarify points which are not otherwise so clear in text. Yeah, I mean, I guess that would push us to to reading more and more Rasail. But at least we're doing something. So inshallah, we're reading Rasail on a semi-regular basis. So I pray that this reading was beneficial and some fa'idah in it. And I ask that inshallah we will keep each other in our du'as and also our besieged brethren. فرج الله تعالى عنهم. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them all a faraj and grant them relief and solace, and to everybody suffering and everybody under unjust oppression in every form. And barakallahu ta'ala fikum. Please keep me in your du'as. Inshallah, keep you in my du'as. And inshallah, I hope to see everybody soon at our next meeting. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.